The corridor smelled of polished marble and expensive cologne. Senator Richard Blackwell was running 3 minutes late, which, in his 22 years of Washington politics, was something he considered a personal insult delivered by the universe. He moved through the halls of the Strategic Defense Command Center the way he always moved, like a man who owned every room he entered, every corridor he walked, every person who happened to be standing in his way. She was standing in his way. She was unremarkable in every possible sense of the word. Medium height, brown hair pulled back in a simple knot, a plain charcoal gray pantsuit that looked like it had been bought off a rack at a mid-range department store. No jewelry, no heels, sensible flat shoes. She was reading something on a tablet, standing just to the right of the corridor's center, and she didn't move when she heard the approaching footsteps of 12 people. The senator, his chief of staff, his 2 personal security agents, his daughter Sophia, 3 congressional aides, 2 military liaisons, a personal photographer, and a communications director. She simply didn't move. "Hey," one of the aides spoke first. "Hey, you need to move. Senator Blackwell is." She still didn't look up. That was when Blackwell himself reached her. He didn't slow down. He extended his right hand, flat, palm outward, and shoved her sideways, hard enough that she stumbled 2 steps and had to catch herself against the wall. Her tablet clattered to the floor. The screen cracked. "Get the F***CK out of my way, C***T. His voice was loud. It echoed. It bounced off the marble walls of the Strategic Defense Command Center, one of the most secure buildings on American soil, and it rang in the ears of the dozen people in his entourage and the 4 security guards stationed at the corridor's end. Sophia Blackwell laughed. A bright, dismissive sound. The senator was already past her, already gone. The young woman pressed her back against the wall. She looked down at her cracked tablet. She picked it up. She looked at the retreating backs of the Blackwell entourage. She said nothing. Captain James Torres, standing at his post at the corridor's end, had watched the whole thing. He was a man who had spent 11 years learning to keep his face neutral. He kept it neutral now, but his hands, behind his back, curled into fists. He doesn't know, Torres thought. God help him. He has absolutely no idea. Alara Voss had arrived at the Strategic Defense Command Center at 0530 that morning, 2.5 hours before anyone else. This was not unusual for her. She had arrived early to every significant event of her adult life. Early to her first day at West Point. Early to her deployment briefing in Kandahar. Early to the classified debrief following the Murmansk incident. And early, devastatingly early, to the field hospital where she'd held her commanding officer's hand as he died from a wound she hadn't been able to prevent. She had learned, in the most brutal school available to human beings, that arriving early meant seeing more, understanding more, and being ready. She had checked the perimeter. She had memorized every exit. She had identified the 3 security vulnerabilities in the building's southeast quadrant and quietly noted them in a report she'd already sent to the facility's security chief. She had met with the event coordinators, reviewed the seating arrangements, approved the modified protocol she had personally requested, and declined, for the 4th time, the offer of a private waiting suite befitting her new position. "I'm fine in the general reception area," she told the flustered young coordinator. "But, Director Voss, the suite is." "Thank you. I'm fine." She preferred the general reception area because it was real. It had people in it. Aides rushing between meetings. Security personnel doing their checks. A janitor named Walter who had, she'd discovered in the 40 minutes she'd been sitting there, worked in this building for 19 years and whose granddaughter had just started kindergarten. She knew more about this building in 2 hours than most people who'd worked here for a decade, because she was always watching, always listening, always the quietest person in the room. This was a habit she had cultivated since she was 9 years old, when she'd realized that quiet people were underestimated, and that being underestimated was, in the right circumstances, the greatest tactical advantage in the world. She was 28 years old today. It was, by any objective measure, a remarkable age to be holding the position she now held. The youngest director of Strategic Nuclear Command in American history. The first woman. The person who, as of this morning's ceremony, would be responsible for the secure management and command authority over the United States nuclear arsenal, the briefcase, the codes, the weight of approximately 5,000 warheads, and the civilization-ending decisions that went with them. She had told no one it was her birthday. She sat in the general reception area in her plain charcoal suit, reading a 340-page classified analysis of adversarial satellite positioning patterns, and she was, by any reasonable observation, indistinguishable from a junior staff assistant who'd been sent ahead to prepare materials. This was intentional. Colonel David Chen found her at 0712. He was 41 years old, a man with iron-gray temples and the kind of posture that announced military service before he opened his mouth, and he was the only person in this building, perhaps in this city, who had known Alara Voss long enough and well enough to understand what she was. He sat down beside her without being invited, because he knew she wouldn't invite him, and she hadn't. "You've read it already," he said, nodding at the tablet. "Twice. The ceremony starts at 0900. I know, David." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, Blackwell is here." She turned a page. "I know. He's going to make this difficult. He's going to try." She looked up at last, and her eyes, gray, direct, entirely unbothered, met his. "He always tries. People like him always try. And then the world shows them what's real." Chen said nothing for a moment. He had watched this woman walk through a firefight in Helmand province without flinching, negotiate a hostage release with a rebel commander in 3 languages she'd taught herself in a 2-week transit window, and solve a cryptographic failure that had stumped the NSA's best analysts for 6 weeks, in 45 minutes, on a legal pad, with a ballpoint pen. He wasn't worried about Richard Blackwell. He was, perhaps, slightly worried for Richard Blackwell. "Happy birthday," he said quietly. She looked back at her tablet, but the corner of her mouth moved. The incident happened at 0827. Torres had been watching Senator Blackwell's party since they'd entered the building at 0820. It was his job to watch everyone, to assess threat levels and behavioral anomalies, and what he'd immediately assessed about the Blackwell party was that approximately 11 of the 12 members were behaving with the performative confidence of people who believed they were the most important people in any room they entered. The 12th member, Sophia Blackwell, the senator's 26-year-old daughter, was behaving with the lazy cruelty of someone who had never once been held accountable for anything. Torres had spent 11 years in security. He could read rooms the way some people read books, and what he read in the Blackwell party was a group of people who moved through the world like it owed them something. The senator led from the front, chest forward, voice loud even in conversation, the kind of man who treated every corridor like a red carpet and every person he encountered as either an obstacle or an audience. He'd watched them approach the intersection at Junction 7, Corridor C. He'd watched the young woman in the gray suit standing against the right wall, absorbed in her reading. He'd recognized her immediately. He'd been briefed. He knew exactly who she was. And he'd watched Senator Blackwell shove her into the wall. The sound of the tablet hitting the marble floor was sharp and clear. In the ringing silence that followed the senator's words, it might as well have been a gunshot. Alara Voss did not react the way most people would have reacted. She did not cry out. She did not stumble dramatically. She did not protest, or shout, or reach for help. She steadied herself against the wall with one hand, an automatic, practiced movement, the movement of someone accustomed to impacts, and she looked at the cracked screen of her tablet with the expression of someone calculating the inconvenience of a minor logistical problem. Then she looked up. The Blackwell party was already moving away. The senator hadn't even turned around. One of his aides, a young man who'd gone white in the face, looked back once, caught Alara's eye, and quickly looked forward again. Sophia Blackwell glanced back too. She saw the gray suit, the flat shoes, the plain hair. She saw ordinary. She saw nobody. She rolled her eyes and kept walking. Torres was at Alara's side in 4 seconds. Professional, controlled, keeping his voice low. "Director Voss, are you all right?" She looked at him. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. Not anger, not hurt, something older and quieter than either of those things. The look of someone who had been underestimated so many times that it had long since ceased to wound them. "Fine," she said. "Do you have a spare tablet?" Torres blinked. "Ah, yes. I can get you one. Thank you." She looked down at the cracked screen. "Make sure it has clearance level 7 access." "Of course." She straightened her jacket. She looked in the direction the Blackwell party had gone. Something moved briefly across her face. Not anger, Torres thought. More like patience. The the particular patience of someone who had learned to let the world do its work. "What time is it?" she asked. 0829, ma'am. "Good," she said. "We have time." She walked on toward the main hall. Torres stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the crack in the tablet screen lying on the marble floor. He thought about what was going to happen in 31 minutes. For the first time that morning, he allowed himself a very small, very controlled smile. A few meters away, behind a half-open door to a side office, Colonel Chun had watched the entire exchange. He had seen the shove. He had heard the words. He had watched Alara absorb it all the way a deep-rooted tree absorbs a storm, without moving, without breaking. He pulled out his phone. He typed a brief message to General Marcus Hayes. "It's going to be a memorable morning, sir." 3 seconds later, "It always is when she's in the building. Is she all right?" Chin typed back. "She asked for a replacement tablet with level 7 clearance." A pause. Then, "That's her version of fine. See you at 0900. Ambassador Klaus Weber of the NATO Special Representative Office had also been in Corridor C at 0827. He had been walking 40 feet behind the Blackwell party, accompanied by 2 of his own aides, en route to the main assembly hall. He had seen everything. Weber was 59 years old, a career diplomat who had attended approximately 400 significant international ceremonies over 3 decades. He had seen powerful people abuse less powerful people hundreds of times, in 100 different cultural contexts. He had learned to recognize the particular flavor of casual cruelty that came from someone who had never once feared consequences. He had also been briefed on Alara Voss. He watched the senator disappear around the corner. He watched the young woman in the gray suit pick up her tablet. He watched her straighten up with the economy of movement of someone very physically capable. He turned to his aide, a sharp young man named Friedrich. "Friedrich," he said. "Sir, make absolutely certain you secure us seats in the front row for the ceremony." Friedrich looked mildly confused. "We already have assigned seats in the front row," Weber said firmly. "I don't want to miss a single expression on a single face in that room." The main assembly hall of the Strategic Defense Command Center was a room that had been designed to project the weight of consequence. High ceilings of gray stone. Banks of flags representing every branch of the American military. A raised dais at the far end, flanked by the national flag and the flag of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The lighting was formal, slightly dim at the edges, focused on the dais. By 0850, the hall held approximately 140 people. Senator Blackwell sat in the second row, directly behind the ambassadorial seats, which he had complained about loudly to his chief of staff. He was accustomed to the front row. He was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He had allocated funding for half the programs this facility ran. He was annoyed. He was also already mentally composing his remarks for the press briefing he'd scheduled afterward, in which he intended to make very clear his reservations about whoever they'd chosen for this director's post. Some political appointment, no doubt, the usual insider game. He intended to make their life difficult in committee. That was how Washington worked. Sophia sat beside him, examining her nails. At 0900 precisely, General Marcus Hayes entered the hall. The room came to attention, not at a barked command, but spontaneously, organically, the way rooms respond to the presence of absolute authority. Hayes was 63 years old, 6 feet 2, with a chest full of decorations that represented 40 years of service across 4 decades of American military engagement. He was, by appointment of the President and confirmation of the Senate, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. He walked to the podium. He did not use notes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. His voice was deep, unhurried, and carried the particular quality of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "Thank you for being here. Today's ceremony represents a transfer of command authority that I consider to be, without qualification or hyperbole, the most significant appointment I have had the privilege of witnessing in 40 years of military service." Blackwell shifted in his seat. He'd expected the usual boilerplate. The position of Director of Strategic Nuclear Command has existed in various forms since 1961, Hayes continued. In that time, it has been held by some of the most capable individuals this nation has produced, people of extraordinary intelligence, courage, and judgment. The individual I am about to introduce to you today is, in my professional assessment, and in the assessment of the President of the United States, Secretary of Defense Morgan, and every senior intelligence and military advisor who has reviewed her record, the finest choice for this position in the history of the office. He paused. I have spent my career learning to recognize excellence. True excellence. Not the manufactured kind, not the credentialed kind, but the real, battle-tested, consequence-proven kind that emerges only from people who have repeatedly chosen the hardest thing when the easiest thing was available to them. Sophia Blackwell had stopped examining her nails. The new director of Strategic Nuclear Command comes to this office with a record that I will briefly and inadequately summarize. 2 combat deployments. 17 confirmed field operations under command. She was personally responsible for the prevention of what we now refer to internally as the Murmansk incident, a near-catastrophic nuclear miscommunication event in 2023 that was resolved in 43 minutes through her personal intervention when our best resource teams had failed for 6 hours. She holds doctoral degrees in strategic nuclear policy, applied mathematics, and international security law. She speaks 7 languages. She was promoted to her current rank at an age that has no precedent in this office. The room was very quiet. She asked me, Hayes said, and here, for the first time, his authoritative composure shifted almost imperceptibly towards something warmer. Not to read her citation at full length today. She said, and I am quoting directly, the people in that room don't need to know my resume, General. They need to know what I can do for them. I found that convincing. He looked down at the secure attaché case on the table beside him. Black, reinforced titanium frame. A very specific kind of lock that required both biometric and alphanumeric authentication. The nuclear briefcase. Not a metaphor. Not a ceremonial prop. The actual transfer case for Strategic Nuclear Command Authority. Director Voss, said General Hayes. Please come forward. The silence that followed those 3 words lasted approximately 4 seconds. To Alara Voss, standing at the side of the dais where she had positioned herself at 0855. Those 4 seconds felt entirely ordinary. She had prepared for this moment. She had, in a sense, been preparing for it since she was 19 years old, and a West Point instructor had told her, with genuine bewilderment, that he had never encountered a strategic mind like hers in 30 years of teaching. She walked to the dais. Calm, unhurried, flat shoes quiet on the stone floor. To Senator Richard Blackwell, those 4 seconds felt like the floor dropping away beneath him. He watched the young woman in the plain gray suit walk up the steps to the dais. The same young woman. The gray suit. The flat shoes. The simple hair. The woman he had shoved. The woman he had called. He felt his chief of staff's hand grip his forearm under the table. He didn't shake it off. He couldn't move. Director Voss. General Hayes lifted the briefcase. With both hands. With the formality of someone handling something that contained, in a very real sense, the fate of civilization, he extended it toward Alara. She accepted it. She received it the same way she did everything, without performance, without theatrics. She held it at her side with one hand and faced the room. Her eyes swept across the assembled audience with the calm, assessing gaze of a strategist reviewing a field. Her eyes found Senator Richard Blackwell. She held his gaze for 1 second. Exactly 1 second. Then she moved on. Thank you, General Hayes, she said, and her voice, clear, even, carrying the particular quality of someone who had given orders in combat and had them followed, filled the room without effort. I accept this responsibility with full understanding of its weight, and with complete commitment to fulfilling it in service of this nation and its allies. She paused. I prefer brevity to ceremony, so I'll be equally brief. We have a lot of work to do, and I intend to begin immediately. I'm grateful to everyone in this room for being here. I look forward to working with you. That was it. She stepped down from the dais. Beside Senator Blackwell, Sophia had gone completely still. Ambassador Weber, in the front row, was making absolutely no attempt to conceal his satisfaction. The 30 minutes following the ceremony were, in the memory of everyone present, unlike any 30 minutes they had experienced in a professional context. The room, which had been organized by event staff into a reception configuration, tables of refreshments along the walls, standing areas for informal conversation, became in effect a masterclass in the social physics of status collapse. Alara moved through the room with Colonel Chun at her shoulder, and the room moved around her like water around a stone, not because she demanded it, but because people who knew were telling people who didn't know, and the information moved in waves. That's her. That's Director Voss. The one Hayes just. Yes, but she's 28. I know. She was in the corridor. When Blackwell. I know. Friedrich, Ambassador Weber's aide, had done his job well. By the time Alara had collected a glass of water and exchanged pleasantries with Secretary of Defense Morgan, Friedrich had quietly, efficiently, circulated the director's official biography to every aide and assistant in the room. Not from malice, from professional instinct. People needed to know who they were dealing with. The biography was a document of considerable force. West Point, 2015, valedictorian. Ranger School, 2016, distinguished graduate. One of the first women to complete the course in its accelerated track. 2 combat deployments, 2017 to 2019. Bronze Star with Valor. Promotion to captain at 22. NSA Secondment, 2019 to 2020. MIT, Accelerated Doctorate in Applied Mathematics, 2021. Oxford, Simultaneous Distance Doctorate in International Security Law. National War College, 2022. And here the biography noted almost casually that she had graduated at the top of a class that included 20 generals and admirals and had rewritten the college's assessment rubric for strategic nuclear analysis. 2023, the Murmansk incident, classified, but the biography's footnote was enough. Sole credited resolution agent. Presidential commendation, classified. 2024, doctorate from Johns Hopkins in strategic nuclear policy. She was 28 years old. She had never, according to anyone who'd worked with her, once talked about any of this unprompted. The biography included a small professional photograph. Plain gray background. No smile. Not a hostile expression. Just the neutral, direct look of someone who understood that the photograph was administrative, not personal. It was the same gray suit she was wearing today. Friedrich delivered a copy to Senator Blackwell's chief of staff, a man named Gary Olson, who had worked in Washington for 20 years and had the particular pallor of someone who had just made a very bad calculation. Gary read the first half page of the biography, then read it again, then looked across the room at his boss. The senator was standing near the far wall, attended by his usual cluster of aides, and he was watching Alara Voss with an expression Gary had never seen on his face before. Gary would later describe it, in confidence, to a journalist. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd stepped onto a highway. Sophia Blackwell had taken her copy of the biography from Friedrich with the polished dismissiveness of someone accustomed to receiving information she intended to ignore. She'd looked at the photograph first. Then she'd looked across the room. Then back at the photograph. That's the same, she stopped. She started over. That's the same woman from the corridor. Friedrich said nothing. He was a professional. She's the... Sophia's voice dropped to almost nothing. Oh God. There was no satisfaction in Friedrich's face. He was simply the messenger. But somewhere behind the professional neutrality, something moved. Ambassador Weber sends his compliments, Ms. Blackwell, he said, and extends his hope that you enjoy the rest of the morning. Colonel Chun was watching all of this with the particular enjoyment of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by Alara's effect on rooms, but had never quite tired of watching it. He'd first met her when she was 21, a second-year cadet who had been sent to his office because she'd identified a flaw in the Army's standard cryptographic rotation protocol and written a 14-page memo about it. Not to her immediate supervisor, but directly to the NSA, because she'd calculated that the supervisor wouldn't understand it fast enough. She'd been completely right about the flaw. She'd also been completely wrong about the chain of command. He'd been sent to discipline her. He'd spent 20 minutes talking to her instead. Then he'd forwarded the memo to every relevant department with his personal endorsement and gone back to her and said, "You were right and you were wrong. In future, be right and be patient." She'd been right and patient ever since. More patient than he would have been. Infinitely more patient. He watched her now, talking with Secretary Morgan and a 3-star general whose name Chun couldn't remember, and she was the same as she always was, attentive, focused, precise. The briefcase was in the hands of her assigned security specialist. She didn't need to hold it to own the authority it represented. She caught his eye across the room. He gave her a slight nod. She turned back to her conversation. Senator Blackwell made his move at 0947. He was not a man who retreated. 22 years in Washington had confirmed for him what he believed since childhood, that offense was survival, that doubling down was strength, that the appearance of certainty was indistinguishable from certainty itself. He had survived 3 ethics investigations, 2 financial scandals, and 1 particularly ugly primary challenge through the same strategy every time. Move forward, be louder than the noise, control the frame. He crossed the room to where Alara was standing. He was aware, on some level, that this was a mistake. He overrode the awareness with the practiced ease of someone who had been overriding better judgment for a very long time. Director Voss, he said, in the hearty, carrying voice he used for constituents and cameras. She turned. Her expression was neutral and attentive. The expression of someone giving a new conversation exactly the level of engagement it had earned. Senator Blackwell, she said, congratulations on your appointment. He extended his hand. Remarkable selection. The committee had, some questions about the accelerated timeline of the appointment process, but I've always said that results speak for themselves. A beat of silence. Chun, standing 5 feet away, noted that 6 other people in the room had turned to watch this conversation while maintaining the studious inattention of people who absolutely did not want to be noticed watching. Thank you, Alara said. She shook his hand. Her grip, by all later accounts, was measured, neither weak nor aggressive. Precisely calibrated. I'd like to schedule a committee briefing, the senator said, slipping into the comfortable authority of his legislative role. Given the scope of your new mandate, the Armed Services Committee will obviously want to. I know, Alara said. I reviewed the committee's oversight schedule this morning. I've allocated time in my calendar for the first briefing on March 15th. My office will send confirmation. She paused. Your committee will have everything it's entitled to. Something about the word entitled landed in a very specific way. Good, Blackwell said. Good. I think you'll find the committee has been very engaged with nuclear. I've read the committee's transcripts for the past 6 years, Alara said. All of them, including the closed sessions. Another beat. The senator had access to classified committee transcripts. The director of Strategic Nuclear Command had access to everything. I appreciate your diligence, he said. His voice had lost approximately 10% of its warmth. I appreciate your committee's work, she replied. She turned her glass of water very slightly in her hand. Senator, I want to be direct with you, because I think directness serves us both better than alternatives. We're going to have a productive working relationship. I will give your committee everything it has oversight authority over, completely and promptly. I would ask, in return, for the good faith engagement that makes oversight valuable rather than performative. She met his eyes. I think we both know what productive looks like. And I think we both know what the alternative looks like. It was the most precise statement of counter-leverage Chun had ever heard delivered without a single specific threat. It was surgical. It acknowledged everything without naming anything. It was, he thought, perhaps the finest 30 seconds of Washington politics he'd witnessed in 20 years. Blackwell held her gaze. He was a man who had learned to read rooms, and what he read in Alara Voss was something he had encountered very rarely in his career and had always found deeply uncomfortable. Absolute certainty. Not aggression. Not hostility. Certainty. She didn't need to threaten him because she didn't need anything from him. She was the director of Strategic Nuclear Command. She could not be fired except by the president. She was not running for anything. She had nothing to protect, because she had conducted her entire career in such a way that there was nothing threatening to expose. She was, in the most complete sense of the term, untouchable. And she had read 6 years of his closed-session committee transcripts. Of course, he said. Of course. I look forward to working with you, Director. Likewise, Senator. He moved away. Gary Olson fell into step beside him. Sir. Not now, Gary. The corridor, Gary said, very quietly. Sir. The corridor this morning. We need to. Not now. Sophia Blackwell found Alara 15 minutes later, briefly alone near the far windows, Chin having stepped away to take a call. Director Voss. Alara turned. Sophia had rehearsed what she was going to say. She was intelligent. Not as intelligent as she allowed herself to be, but intelligent. And she understood that this was a moment that required specific handling. An apology. Measured, dignified. Her father had made a mistake in the corridor. She had made a mistake in the corridor. And the woman they'd made it to was. She looked at Alara's face. The level gray eyes. The complete absence of either hostility or invitation. Everything she'd rehearsed evaporated. I'm sorry, she said. It came out smaller than she'd intended. For this morning. In the corridor. I should have said something. I didn't. Alara studied her for a moment. No, she said. You didn't. I'm sorry, Sophia said again. I heard you. A pause. Will you? Sophia stopped. Cleared her throat. Is there anything I can do? Alara looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone making a genuine assessment of a person, not a judgment. You can do better next time, she said. Not for my sake. Because it's the right thing to do. She walked away. Sophia stood near the windows for a long moment, holding a glass she'd forgotten she was carrying, and thought about the gap between the person she was and the person she was capable of being. The first operational briefing of Director Voss's tenure began at 1100, in Conference Room A, a windowless, hardened space 3 levels below the main hall, where the air was filtered and the walls absorbed all electronic signals, and 12 of the most senior military and intelligence officers in the country sat around a table that cost more than most people's homes. Alara walked in at 10:59. She had changed nothing about her appearance. She set the briefcase, back in her own hands now, on the table beside her chair. She sat. She opened a folder. She waited. General Hayes took his seat across from her. He watched her with the expression of a man who was doing something he'd been waiting a long time to do, handing over to someone better. At 1100 exactly, she began. Good morning. I won't be using slides. A mild ripple around the table. Every director before her had used slides. I find that slides encourage people to look at the presentation rather than each other. And the most critical information in this room is what each of you knows that isn't yet written down. We'll start with open assessment. I want each of you to tell me the one thing about your area of responsibility that you believe is most urgent and least understood by leadership. Silence. Generals and admirals, in Shin's experience, did not typically respond to direct, open-ended questions from new directors by offering their most honest, unfiltered assessments. They were trained to present, not to confess. Alara seemed to understand this. She let the silence last exactly long enough to make it clear she was going to wait as long as necessary. Then Admiral Raymond Chu, the director of naval operations, a man of 61 who had never, in Shin's experience, offered an unsolicited, candid observation in his life, said, Our Pacific Acoustic Surveillance Network has a 17-hour detection gap that nobody above the level of 3-star has been told about because the last 2 directors didn't want to hear about funding problems. Shin watched Alara process this. She didn't show surprise. She wrote something on her notepad. Thank you, Admiral Chu, she said. Who else? They went around the table. Not everyone spoke. Some of the older hands were still evaluating her, still waiting to see what she did with what she was given. But 6 of the 12 people in the room offered her something real, something that had been stuck in the system for months or years, something that previous leadership had either not asked for or hadn't known how to receive. She took notes. She asked questions. Her questions were precise, technically exact, and drew, visibly, in real time, connections between information that the separate departments had not known the others possessed. At one point, she asked General Hollis of the Air Force a question about missile silo maintenance scheduling that made Hollis look at her as if she'd materialized from the technical manuals themselves. How did you? He started. I read your department's maintenance logs for the past 3 years. There's a pattern in the Q3 scheduling that suggests a staffing optimization problem that's compounding over time. I can walk you through it after this briefing if you'd like. She hadn't been director for 3 hours. She'd read 3 years of maintenance logs. Hollis looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at the table, but the slight movement at the corner of his mouth was visible to Chun, who had known him for 15 years. By the time the briefing concluded at 1220, 20 minutes past its scheduled end, not because it had run long, but because no one had wanted it to stop. The atmosphere in Conference Room 8 had undergone a transformation that Shin would later struggle to describe accurately. The best he could manage was, it was like watching 12 people who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and hadn't been allowed to put it down. And she just said, put it down. Here, let me see it. And they did. By 1400, in offices and corridors and secure message threads throughout the Strategic Defense Command Center, the machinery of institutional knowledge, The informal network of aides and assistants and mid-level officers who truly understand how any large organization functions had assembled a more complete picture of Alara Voss than her official biography contained. This was partly because Colonel Chun, who had been with her for 17 years and was constitutionally incapable of small talk, had been approached by approximately 9 people since the ceremony asking careful, probing, professionally appropriate questions about the new director and had answered each of them with the same response. Look up the Baglin operation. Look up Murmansk. Look at the MIT thesis. Then look at her and think about whether anything you've seen today surprises you. The Baglin operation was classified at a level that most people in the building couldn't access. But the people asking the questions could, and they did, and what they found had the particular quality of information that reshapes your understanding of everything that preceded it. In 2019, during Alara's second deployment, her unit had been ambushed in Baghlan Province, Afghanistan. The commanding officer, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Frank Torres, Captain James Torres's uncle, who had served 30 years and was 3 months from retirement, had been critically wounded in the first 30 seconds of the engagement. Alara, then a 22-year-old captain, had assumed command of a unit in active contact, managed the evacuation, suppressed the ambush, and extracted all personnel, including 4 wounded, calling and coordinating a medevac under sustained fire. Frank Torres had survived. He'd lost his left arm, but he'd made it home. The Bronze Star with Valor didn't fully cover it, but it was what the classification levels permitted. The MIT thesis was titled Deterministic Failure Modes in Nuclear Command and Control Architecture under Asymmetric Information Conditions, and had been described by one peer reviewer as the single most important unpublished analysis of nuclear command vulnerability produced in the 21st century. It was 847 pages long. She'd written it in 14 months while simultaneously completing her NSA secondment. The Murmansk incident was still largely classified, but the outlines were these. In February 2023, a combination of sensor malfunction and satellite data corruption had produced readings that triggered Level 4 nuclear response protocols across 3 NATO member states simultaneously. The standard response architecture, which had been designed over decades and cost several $billion, had failed to resolve the crisis in 6 hours because the failure was novel and the protocols were not. Alara, who had been at the National War College at the time, had been contacted because someone who'd read her thesis had remembered a particular section on asymmetric failure cascades in exactly this type of scenario. She had driven to the Pentagon. She had asked for a legal pad. She had worked for 43 minutes. The solution she produced had been subsequently incorporated into NATO's revised nuclear response protocols. She had been 26. She had never told anyone about any of this voluntarily. Not because she was modest. Modesty is a performance, and she didn't perform. But because the work was what mattered. The recognition was noise. Torres, Captain James Torres, who had been watching the day unfold from his posts throughout the building, who had read the briefing about Alara a week ago, and had spent that week thinking about what kind of person does what she'd done and makes nothing of it, went to find her at 14:30. He found her in a small, rarely used office on the 2nd floor, alone, looking out of a narrow window at the gray February sky. The briefcase was on the desk beside her. She wasn't looking at it. He knocked on the open door. She looked at him. "My uncle," he said. "Frank Torres. Baghlan, 2019. Her expression changed, just slightly. Something opened in it, something that was, perhaps, the closest she came to unguardedness. "He was the best commanding officer I ever served under," she said. Torres's jaw worked for a moment. He'd grown up with his uncle's stories of the army, and then, after Baghlan, with the different, quieter stories. His uncle never talked about who had gotten him out. Classified. But he'd always known, from the way it was referenced in family conversations, that someone had. "He never told us who," Torres said. "No," she agreed. "He wouldn't have." A silence. "He's well?" she asked. "He coaches high school football in Colorado," Torres said. "He says it's better." She nodded. "He was going to make it home regardless," she said. "I just made it faster." Torres looked at her for a long moment. "Happy birthday, Director Voss," he said. She looked back at the window. "Thank you, Captain Torres." Senator Richard Blackwell's position on the Senate Armed Services Committee gave him, in theory, significant oversight authority over the Strategic Defense Command. In practice, The exercise of oversight authority required the good faith of the institution being overseen, and good faith, like most things in Washington, had a way of responding to how it was offered. What unfolded in the days and weeks following the ceremony was less a dramatic confrontation than a systematic, quiet, methodical restructuring of the information environment around the senator. On March 15th, Director Voss attended the scheduled committee briefing. She arrived on time. She answered every question completely, accurately, and at a level of technical detail that required Gary Olson to hire, on short notice, a specialist consultant just to brief the senator on what she was actually saying. She brought documentation that addressed the committee's standard concerns before they were raised. She was entirely cooperative. She was also, without any particular effort, making it clear that the oversight structure worked better when driven by substantive engagement rather than political positioning. And she was doing it in a way that was making the other 14 committee members look very carefully at the quality of their chairman's questions. This was, in the considered opinion of 3 senior committee staff, the most elegant piece of institutional pressure they had ever witnessed. More significantly, the morning after the ceremony, Torres had submitted an incident report. He was required to. Security protocol mandated the documentation of any physical altercation involving cleared personnel within the facility, regardless of severity. The report was accurate, factual, and entirely devoid of editorializing. It documented the time, location, parties involved, and nature of the incident. The incident report went to the facility's security chief. The security chief forwarded it, as required, to the DoD Inspector General. The Inspector General's office notified the relevant congressional ethics bodies, as required by statute, when the incident involved a member of Congress. None of these steps were taken by Alara. She had not filed a complaint. She had not requested any action. She had, as far as anyone could document, done nothing in response to what had happened in the corridor except ask for a replacement tablet. The machinery of the institution did what the institution did. Gary Olson spent several sleepless weeks navigating a process that was notable above all for its complete indifference to anyone's preferences. It did not care that the senator was powerful. It did not care that the incident had been brief and that no lasting physical harm had occurred. It cared about the regulations, the statutes, and the documentation. The Senate Ethics Committee opened a preliminary inquiry. It was quiet. It was preliminary, but it was open. Blackwell retained outside counsel. His approval rating in his home state, which had hovered reliably at 54% for 6 years, dropped 4 points in 2 weeks following the circulation, by unknown parties, through Washington's informal press channels, of a second-hand account of the corridor incident. The account was never formally attributed. It didn't need to be. Washington was a city where information moved like water through stone, slowly and inevitably. Sophia Blackwell called Gary Olson on the 15th day after the ceremony. "Is there anything that can be done," she said, "to make this better? With Director Voss? Can we reach out?" Gary was quiet for a moment. "She hasn't said anything. She hasn't done anything." "I know," Sophia said. "That's sort of the point, Gary." She was right. Alara's silence was not passive. It was not forgiveness, and it was not pursuit. It was the silence of someone who had moved on because she had more important things to think about. And that particular indifference was, in its own way, the most complete assessment of the senator's significance that she could have offered. Sophia sent a handwritten note. She did not expect a response. She received one, 3 days later. A small card, no logo, plain white. "Ms. Blackwell, thank you for writing. I meant what I said. Better is always possible. E.V." It was the most humanizing 3 sentences Sophia had received in years. She put the card in her desk drawer and didn't mention it to anyone. Ambassador Weber, in his report to the NATO Secretary General, included a 3-paragraph addendum to his account of the command transfer ceremony. The addendum described, with his characteristic precision, the incident in the corridor, the ceremony, and his observations of Director Voss throughout the morning. His conclusion read, "I have attended ceremonies of this nature for 31 years. I have rarely left one with the certainty that the right person held the right office. I leave this one with that certainty. The United States has made an appointment that will matter." The Secretary General read the addendum, set it aside, and arranged a meeting with Director Voss for the following month. It was late. The Strategic Defense Command Center was quiet at 2,200. Not silent, never silent. Because the work it did not sleep, and the people who did it took shifts, and the machinery of deterrence hummed through every hour of every day without interruption. But the administrative levels were empty, the lights were low, and the corridor that had smelled of polished marble and expensive cologne smelled now only of marble. Alara sat in the small second-floor office that had been assigned to her as a temporary space while her permanent offices were being prepared. She would be moving to a much larger suite next week, a suite with a window that looked over the Potomac, a suite that came with a staff of 12 and a private security detail and a communications infrastructure that could reach anyone on Earth within 90 seconds. Tonight she was in the small room with a desk lamp and a legal pad and the briefcase and a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. She was writing, not typing, writing, in the long, careful script she'd used since childhood, the visible form of thinking that she'd never been able to do as well any other way. The legal pad was full of policy assessments, strategic reconfigurations, proposals for the command structure reforms she'd identified in the first day's briefing as necessary. They were dense and technical and important, and she would refine them and formalize them and present them. And they would, she was reasonably confident, be implemented because they were right, and being right was, in her experience, sufficient when paired with patience. She stopped writing. She looked at the briefcase. She had held it, briefly, during the ceremony, felt the weight of it, the clean metallic reality of it. The weight was both exactly what she'd expected and nothing like what she'd expected. It was a physical object. It was also everything that the word responsibility meant when the word was used seriously, without rhetoric or performance. She was 28 years old today. She thought about her father, who had been an electrical engineer in a small town in Vermont, and who had taught her that problems were solved by looking at them steadily until they yielded their structure. She thought about Frank Torres, coaching high school football in Colorado with one arm. She thought about the Murmansk incident, the 43 minutes, the legal pad, the particular clarity of a moment when everything unnecessary falls away and what remains is only the problem and the mind addressing it. She thought, briefly, about a corridor that smelled of expensive cologne, a cracked tablet screen, a voice saying words designed to make her feel small. She was not small. She had never been small. She had chosen to appear small because appearing small was useful, and because the work was what mattered, and because the best protection for the things you valued was to give no one a reason to threaten them. She picked up the pen. She wrote, Day 1. The structure is addressable. The gaps are closable. The work is the work. She underlined it once. She looked at the briefcase again for a moment. The weight of it, the reality of it, the enormous, sobering, clarifying fact of what it meant to hold it. Then she turned back to the legal pad and kept writing. There was a lot to do. She had always been good at doing a lot. Outside the window, the lights of Washington reflected off the low winter clouds, and somewhere in the building below, Torres was doing his last check of the evening, and somewhere in Colorado, a retired lieutenant colonel with one arm was probably sleeping the good sleep of a man who'd made it home, and somewhere in a Senate office building, a man with expensive cologne was having a very difficult conversation with his attorney. None of that changed the work. The work was the work. Alara Voss, Director of Strategic Nuclear Command, youngest in the history of the office, bearer of the briefcase, solver of crises that others had declared unsolvable. She kept writing. The office was quiet. The night was long. She was exactly where she was supposed to be.